So we are without excuse. And I want to say this before we go into the attributes of God, that this is far from an exhaustive list. And it's a list based on Charles Spurgeon's list. He put it together, and he was a 19th century preacher and theologian. And the first one we're going to look at is wisdom. God has great wisdom, and His creation helps us understand this wisdom by making it more real to us. Psalm 104, which I mentioned earlier, verses 10 through 17, actually talk about how one aspect of God's creation allows another one to function. God, when we see this ourselves, when we examine the cycle of life, or when we take a deeper look at something outside with either our eyes, our thoughts, or our hearts. In Romans 11:33, it says God is wise. It says, "Oh, the depth of riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are His judgments and inscrutable His ways." So God is wise. We can't understand. His judgments are unsearchable to us. He is wise. God's wisdom can see in many areas of creation, even with birds. Birds are the brightest and sing the loudest in the springtime. That is the time of their mating. That is the time they mate. So when they have their chicks in late spring and early summer, that is when their food is most abundant to feed their chicks. Now, but people may write that off and say, well, that's the way it should happen. No, but that's how God designed it in His wisdom. And we can see God's wisdom in other areas of life too. In the 1920s and 1930s, riverside cottonwoods, willows, and aspens began to disappear from Yellowstone National Park. The Park Service started asking the question why. The answer would not come until nearly 70 years later. You see, in the mid-1920s, the National Park Service eliminated all the wolves in and around the park. It was not until the late 1990s that the wolves were reintroduced into the park, and the majesty and the mystery of the wolves' howl was heard again in the park. Oddly enough, or strangely enough, the willows, aspens, and cottonwoods began to grow by the riverside. A study released in the early 2000s showed why. With the absence of the wolf, elk grazed and roamed where they pleased. And they gathered by the riverside, and they ate the new trees that would come up. So the trees had no chance to grow. But when the wolves arrived, the elk could no longer linger by the streams. As a result, the trees began to grow. And as a result of the trees growing, there's more trout in the streams, more migratory birds, and even more beavers. See, Yellowstone's ecosystem is God's eye, but people thought they knew better, and they get rid of the top predator, and that mismanaged the system. In God's wisdom, He made a system that works in balance and benefits the creatures He created. Despite living in a fallen world, despite this world being corrupted by our sin, God is still able to make a system in balance. But there is much pain and suffering because of our sin, and much of that pain and suffering is brought about by the wolf. But yet it's still that system working in that balance, because God, in His infinite wisdom, is able to make a system in balance despite the world being fallen. The same is true for our culture. Key elements such as God, morality, traditional marriage, ethics, integrity are being removed from our culture. And the aspects of the willow trees in our culture are suffering, and there's going to be long-term repercussions. Not only is it true on a cultural scale, it's true on an individual scale as well. Many Christians have lost their morality, their Judeo-Christian ethic, and integrity in their own lives. Unfortunately, when that happens, we bring that value collapse home. For the wills and the lives of many believers are suffering. A question we need to ask ourselves is, how are my wills doing? Is there any trouble in my stream? We need to live by God's word and God's ways. We need to live holy lives and follow after Him. And maybe then the willows in our lives and our culture will grow again. And that leads us to our next topic, which is God's holiness and His purity.